Hello everyone, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dhiman Bhattacharya, Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature, Center for Comparative Literature, Bhasha Bhavan, Vishbharati. The author of this module is Dr. Shagota Bhattacharya. The course is Canadian Literature and this particular module deals with Canadian prose fiction. The main objectives of this particular module are the development of prose in Canada, contextualizing prose fiction in Canada within CanLit, identifying the major authors and their works, understanding the broader thematics closely aligned with the historicism of the formation of the genres, understanding the interlinkages of class identities and the identities of the author related with the choice of themes. The first writers in Canada were explorers, travelers, and British Army officers who recorded their impressions of British North America in diaries, journals, and letters. These were the earliest examples of prose writing in English in Canada. They were mostly accounts of journeys and heroic achievements of conquering the vast, unknown North and encounters with the natives who lived there. The earliest examples of such Canadian prose are Samuel Hearne's A Journey from Prince of Wales' Fort in Hudson Bay to the Northern Ocean, 1795, and Sir Alexander Mackenzie's Voyages from Montreal through the continent of North America to the frozen and Pacific Oceans, 1801. Compared to prose, poetry had developed faster in the early period in English Canada. However, till the 1900s, the historical romance was the only form of popular prose in Canada. Julia Hart's St. Ursula's Convent or The Nun of Canada, 1824, and William Kirby's The Golden Dog, 1877, were quite popular at the time. By 1900s, novels of local color started to overshadow the historical romances. The earliest among them was Lucy Maud Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables, 1908. Also Ralph Connor, Stephen Leacock, and Mazo de la Roche were the best-selling writers of the period. Frederick Philip Grove wrote novels depicting man's struggle for mastery over himself and his land, and Emily Carr wrote stories about her encounters with the First Nations in British Columbia. For example, Killie Weeks, 1941. The 1940s and 50s saw a great boom in novels, which were centered on sensitive artists or restless children as protagonists. Sinclair Ross's As for Me and My House, 1941, Ernest Buckler's The Mountain and the Valley, 1952, are milestones of this period. The other significant novel of this time was Hugh MacLennan's Two Solitudes, 1945. After the 1950s, short stories slowly began to make their way in Canadian literature. Alice Munro, Margaret Lawrence, Leonard Cohen, and Mavis Gallant created characters of remarkable strength and beauty in their short stories. Munro's stories, in collection ranging from Dance of the Happy Shades, 1968, to The View from the Castle Rock, 2006, depict the domestic lives and relationships of strong, independent women in the small towns of Ontario and British Columbia. While Cohen celebrated the relationship between sainthood, violence, eroticism, and artistic creativity, Mavis Gallant depicted isolated characters with fragile words of illusion surrounding them. Gradually, Margaret Atwood took over the reigns from her predecessors and dissected contemporary urban life and sexual politics with trenchant irony in her novels and short stories. Several writers in the 1960s and 70s subverted the traditional conventions of fiction and shifted from realist to surrealist, self reflexive, and feminist modes. During the 1980s and 90s, the ideas of self and nation, of belonging and loss, and the breaking down of the traditional boundaries of gender and genre gradually became important. Also, from this period onwards, Canadian writing in English was no longer restricted only to white Canada but started incorporating the First Nations and the various diasporas. It is very interesting to note about the growth of poetry in Canada, which almost evoked the essence of human existence on this world, as if poetry came very naturally. The development of prose and the further experiments with the generic classifications is remarkable as far as Canada is concerned. As we all know that primarily being a land of settlers as we understand Canada to be, the first pieces of prose were in the form of diaries. Gradually the short story developed, Alice Munro, Margaret Lawrence Atwood being one of the pioneers amongst the group of new Canadians that started experimenting with their prose. It is very interesting that of late, gradually, the First Nations people and people of various diasporas also contributed in their own way in the development of prose narrative in Canada. We gradually move towards the authors. Alice Munro, born in 1931, was born in Wingham, Ontario. She studied English and journalism at the University of Western Ontario. In 1951, she married James Munro and moved to West Vancouver. Later, in 1963, the couple moved to Victoria and opened a store called Munro's Books. Most of Alice Munro's stories are set in Huron, where a girl tries to come to terms with her family and the small town she grew up in. Munro is famous as a short story writer, which eventually won her the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2013. Her famous works include Tongues of the Happy Shades, 1968, Lives of Girls and Women, 1971, Hate Ship, Friendship, Courtship, Love Ship, Marriage, 2001, and Runaway, 2004. The Jacques Randa Hotel. The Jacques Randa Hotel revolves around Kale, a Canadian woman of Russian origin. Galia had moved to Canada with her family and had become Gail to make herself more Canadian. At a very young age, she had moved away from her family with a boyfriend and had lived her life on her terms. After having lost her baby in an accident, Gail one day meets Will, who desperately falls in love with her. She settles down with Will and his mother, and just when she feels that her life is perfect and happy, Will leaves her for a much younger woman. Will and his new partner Sandra settle down in Brisbane. A jilted Gail decides to follow Will and see with her own eyes how happy he is with this other woman. She tells her business, collects a large sum of money, and carefully changes her hairstyle, clothes, and her entire get-up. She then sets off for her adventure to Brisbane. On reaching the place, she finds out Will's house and manages to sneak out the information that Will is in correspondence with a woman called Mrs. Thornaby. Gail goes to the place and finds out that Mrs. Thornby is dead. She hires a flat and herself possesses as Miss Thornby and continues to correspond with Will. She was hopeful that will lead Will to come to the place in search of Mrs. Thornaby one day. What she had hoped for did happen. Will actually came looking for the lady to whom he has been writing, but when she saw him coming, she could not bring herself to face him. She locked herself inside the apartment while Will banged on the door. He realized that it was Gail, his former wife, and no one else. The moment he left, Gail vacated the apartment and rushed to the airport. She was still undecided where she would go now, but she was sure of one thing, that from now on it was Will's turn to follow her. Will had once left her for the woman who no longer fascinated him, and she was sure that the fact that she had actually followed him to Australia from Canada would make him realize that it was she who actually loved him. Thus, now it was Will's turn to follow Gail all over the world and find out where she was. Ernest Buckler, 1908 to 1984, was born in the village of West Dalhousie, Nova Scotia. He studied philosophy at the University of Toronto and later joined his firm in Bridgetown. He is famous for his celebrated work, The Mountain and the Valley, 1952. Buckler had been awarded the Canadian Centennial Medal 1967 and was made an Officer of Order of Canada 1974. Penny in the Dust. Penny in the Dust treats a theme common in Ernest Buckler's fiction: the painful subtleties of family relationships and the anguish of unarticulated love. It is the story of a strange bond of love between a father and his son, both of whom are unable to express their feelings for each other. The story begins on the day of the father's funeral, when his son lovingly remembers the childhood memories he has shared with his family, his sister, and especially his father. The day brings to his mind, in particular, one incident which took place several years ago. His father had one day gifted him a shiny penny which he had longed for as a child. One day, while he was playing with the penny, it fell down from his hands and slipped into the dust. The frightened child thought that he had lost the penny forever and hid himself in a hiding place. He was completely unaware of the fact that his absence for a long period of time made his parents anxious and nervous. His father ran to and fro frantically searching for the child and getting more and more anxious with every passing minute. Ultimately, it was his mother who discovered him and took him back home. The next day, his father wanted to know the reason for such behavior, and the child thought that even if he explained, his father would not understand. But to his surprise, his father attentively listened to his story, took him to the exact spot where the penny was lost, and without much difficulty soon recovered the penny. From that day onwards, his father kept the penny to himself. The child's fancy with the penny was over, but his father's was not. He kept the penny in the vest pocket till his last day, when his son discovered it while taking him into his funeral. The penny was as shiny and bright as ever. It remained the symbol of love and affection that the father and son shared for each other, and that which none of them could express to the other. Mordecai Richler, 1931 to 2001. Mordecai Richler was born in Montreal in a Jewish community and raised on St. Urbain Street. He worked at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and moved to London for work. In 1972, he returned to Montreal and worked as a journalist. Richler has written a number of short stories, essays, travelogues, film scripts, and fiction for children. His celebrated works include The Apprenticeship of Didi Kravitz, 1959, and St. Urbain's Horseman, 1971. Benny. Benny is set in St. Urbain Street, a typical setting in Richler's work. It was a place populated by Jews of Canada, and the community had a particular characteristics of their own. Benny was the youngest son of the Garber family, a simple and dull boy who was not sure about whatever he wanted to do in life. In his youth, Benny first joined the army and went to Europe during the Second World War. After the war, he returned with an injury about which none of his family members were ever aware. Benny was extraordinarily quiet, though at times he behaved ridiculously strange. His elder brother took him as a mechanic in his garage, and Benny was a sincere worker there. His behavior was irrational and unexplained. No one, including his parents, had any great hopes on Benny. Though his father liked to compare him with his neighbor Shapiro and say that Benny was nothing compared to Sapphiro's boy. Yet that stupid Benny one day declared to marry Bella, the daughter of the local barman. Bella had a defect in her foot by birth and was singularly unattractive. Thus, everyone thought that the marriage between Bella and Benny was a perfect one. They seemed to enjoy a happy conjugal life, and after some time, Bella declared that she would like to be a mother, and before that, she would first like to cure herself. She explained that she had been to Shapiro's clinic where she had been assured that her foot shall be completely cured. The next morning, Billy fell ill, and when Bella returned with the doctor, they found him already dead. It was Dr. Sapphiro who declared him dead, possibly without knowing that it was he who was the reason for Benny's annoyance with life. Since his childhood, Benny has been compared to Sapphiro in every field: studies, career, marriage. Thus, when Benny found out that his wife had consulted Sapphiro to cure him, he felt that he could not tolerate it anymore. His father had throughout his life compared him to Sapphiro, and now his wife wanted to depend on him to make their life happy. Therefore, Benny decided to quit the competition in which he knew he was no match for his opponent. It is very interesting to note that in the formative years of Canadian prose fiction, the authors brought in several tales from the daily life to conjure their fictional characters. The novel as a genre, or the short story as a genre, was gradually finding its place in the prose writing of Canada. The prose fiction, which probably started with the diaries of the pioneers, gradually culminated into the genres that the later authors explore, be it the novel or the short story. The subject matter or the Rostov of this short story gradually came to be adopted from the ordinariness of life in the adopted land. Gabriele Roy, 1909 to 1983. Gabriele Roy was born in Manitoba and settled in Quebec post the Second World War as a sketch artist. She was a teacher, and many of her short stories are based on her personal experiences as a school teacher. Gabriele Roy is one of the most significant Francophonie writers in Canada. Born here, the occasion, the Tin Flute, 1945 was her first novel. Her other novels include Rue des Humboldt, Street of Riches, 1945, and Ces Enfants de ma vie, Children of My Heart, 1977. La Maison Gabriele Roy is a museum in the childhood home of the author in St. Boniface, Manitoba. The Dead Child is the first-person account of a school teacher who had just arrived in a very small village in Manitoba as a substitute teacher. The students there belonged to extremely poor Metis families. As the new teacher called out their names on her first day in class, she realized how weary the faces of these children were. This matter-of-fact announcement astonished the teachers, who was at a loss for appropriate words. The children, who had been very quiet till now, continued that she is being readied to her funeral. The teacher realized that the expressions in the eyes of these children had been so long mistaken by her. What she mistook for indifference was actually a heavy sadness. She declared that as her teacher, though she missed the opportunity of teaching the girl and her classmates, all of them should go to Yolande's house and bid her farewell for the last time. Accordingly, after school, the whole class guided their new teacher to Yolande's, but where the dead child lay. The family was so poor that they could not afford to lay the child on a bed. But as an ultimate gesture, her parents had gone to buy her a clean sheet of cloth. The teacher arranged her students to pick flowers and place them over the body. They also recounted tales of how Yolande was as a child. She was a pretty girl who loved books and looked beautiful in her dresses. She was someone who could have grown up into a beautiful young girl and who now looked like a tremendous waste of potential. The children formed a ring round the girl and decorated her with flowers. As they did so, they considered that she must be happy by now. She was one of those children who had had very few moments of joy in her lifetime. The incident made a deep impact on the teacher, who remembered it for a long, long time. Yolande was not a case of exception. She was one of those children who succumbed to tuberculosis as a result of poor living conditions and malnutrition in those parts of the country. Susanna Moody was born in Suffolk, England. She migrated to Canada with her husband in 1832 and settled in the north of Peterborough. Moody's writings had been published mainly in England for British readers who enjoyed her antipathy towards Canada and her native customs. Roughing It in the Bush, 1852, was published in the form of memoir in England, in which she wrote about her dislike for many of the Canadian customs. She has also written poems and a children's book called Spartacus, 1822. The Charivari. The Charivari is more of a documentation of a particular custom in Canada than a short story. It was a custom which originated from the French in the lower province of Canada. According to the custom, when an old man married a young wife or a woman a young husband, people of the neighborhood raided their house and demanded money. The custom was also applicable if two old people married for the second or third time. The young people of the neighborhood painted their faces and proceeded to the place where the wedding is held with instruments creating violent sounds. Susanna Moody herself, who was frightened by a terrible commotion one night while her husband was away, is reflected in this novel. It was her neighbor, Mrs. O, who explained to her the source of the noise and told her everything about the custom. She even recounted several tales in which these apparently comical customs had turned fatal and taken people's lives. Usually it was a matter of simple bargain, and older men were generally let off gently if they paid up. As the old woman had once married a much younger man and had been the victim of the local fellows, every evening they gathered before her house and created nuisance by playing loud music, drinking and abusing the lady, and even burning her effigy. The lady, instead of protest, seemed to welcome them. This continued for some time, and one day she invited the leader of this party of young men to tea in her house. It was to the tremendous embarrassment of this young man that the ridiculous ritual began at 7 o'clock while he sat drinking tea in her sitting room. To his dismay, the lady declared that her husband and she enjoyed their evening tea with these abuses at their background music, and they would feel lonely without the commotion. From the next day onwards, the band was dismantled and the lady and her husband were left in peace. Thus, the lady managed to deal with the situation very tactfully. Mrs. O asserted that, however disgraceful the cut of Charivari was, its intention was actually well-meaning. It wanted to stop people from making wrong moves and disgraceful marriages. Clark Blaise, born in 1940s in North Dakota, did his graduation in creative writing from the University of Iowa. It was at Iowa Writers' Workshop where he met Bharati Mukherjee for the first time, and they got married and eventually settled in Canada in 1966. Blaise had been the director of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. His famous works include A North American Education, 1973, Tribal Justice, 1974, Lunar Attractions, 1979, Man and His World, 1992. His autobiography, I Had a Father, was published in 1993. He also co-authored Days and Nights in Calcutta 1977 and The Sorrow and the Terror of the Haunting Legacy of Air India Tragedy 1987 with Bharati Mukherjee. Going to India. Going to India is a semi-autobiographical narrative about an American man going on a holiday to India, his wife's ancestral home. Readers of this story should be aware that in reality the writer Clark Blaise was married to Bharati Mukherjee, who hailed from India, and that he had actually co-authored a book called Days and Nights in Calcutta with his wife. In his story, the writer expresses his anxiety and anguish as he prepares himself for his impending trip to India, a place which is completely alien to him. The story begins with premonitions of death, which in a way reflect his tense state of mind. He has been preparing himself for the trip for a very long time. His wife, Anjali Chatterjee, was his only source of gathering some idea about the country. His wife's parents, unable to alter their daughter's choice, had accepted him unwillingly as their son-in-law. But he had never actually thought at the time of his marriage that it would feel like visiting the country which was so familiar to his wife and which was completely alien to him. At the time of his marriage, what he had felt was that he was marrying an individual person and not a culture. However, now, when preparations are being made to visit India, the fact that he is being confronted with so many unknown things annoys him and frightens him to get extent. Primarily, it was lineage that concerned him. What was a matter of no consequence in America assumed supreme significance in India. Born in a fractured family and brought up without any family ties, he had no concern whatsoever with family obligations, which mattered so much in India. Prose fiction in Canada gradually evolved as a form of writing that captured the essence of living in Canada. This was closely aligned with the relationship with the nature and definitely the people who were at the receiving ends, that is, the native people. There was gradually a tendency to understanding, or at least have an understanding of what Canada is all about, as prose developed at a much later stage compared to the poems in Canada. So as the literary genre evolved, it also accumulated years of experience and histories within the frame or within the fabric of its production.